The moon hung like a silver dollar in the Nebraska sky when Preston Norwood heard the woman's voice cutting through the midnight stillness. And something about the raw loneliness in her words made him pull his horse to a stop, instead of riding on through Scottsbluff like he'd planned. He'd been traveling for 3 weeks straight, driving a small herd of cattle north from Texas, his bones weary and his heart even wearier. But the sound of someone else's pain called to something deep inside him that he couldn't ignore. She stood on a small rise just outside town, her silhouette dark against the moonlit prairie, her hands raised toward the heavens as if the moon might actually answer her prayers. "I know you're listening up there," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "I know someone has to be listening because I can't bear this silence anymore. Mama's been gone 2 years now, Papa just last winter, and I wake up every morning wondering why I'm still here when everyone I loved has left me behind." Preston dismounted quietly, leading his horse by the reins as he approached. He knew he should probably announce himself, but something told him to wait, to listen, to understand before interrupting whatever sacred moment this was between a lonely soul and the night sky. "Sarah got married and moved to California last spring," the woman continued, and Preston could hear tears thickening her voice now. "Even Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house treats me like I'm already a ghost, like my loneliness is something that might be catching. I'm 23 years old and I feel like I've lived 100 lifetimes, every one of them alone." Preston's chest tightened. He was 26 himself, and he understood loneliness in a way most people never would. His parents had died in a cholera outbreak when he was 17, leaving him to raise his younger sister alone. When she'd married a good man 2 years ago and moved east to start her own family, Preston had been happy for her but devastated for himself. The ranch that had once been full of laughter and life now echoed with emptiness, and he'd taken to trailing cattle just to have a reason to keep moving, to avoid the silence that waited for him at home. "I try to be strong," the woman whispered. "I try to smile at the general store and make pleasant conversation with the ladies after church, but inside I'm screaming. Inside I'm so tired of pretending that I'm fine, that I don't mind eating dinner alone every night, that I don't miss having someone to talk to who actually cares what I have to say." Preston took another step forward, a twig snapping under his boot, and the woman whirled around with a gasp. In the moonlight, he could see her face clearly now, tear-stained and beautiful, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that held entire universes of sorrow. She wore a simple calico dress, the kind a working woman would wear, and her hands were clasped against her chest as if trying to protect her heart from further damage. "I didn't mean to startle you," Preston said softly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "I was riding through and I heard you talking. I should have announced myself sooner, but I couldn't help but listen. I know what it's like to feel that kind of alone." The woman's eyes widened, and for a moment Preston thought she might run. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself and looked back up at the moon. "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough," Preston admitted. "Long enough to hear someone putting words to feelings I've carried for 2 years now. I'm Preston Norwood. I run cattle between Texas and Wyoming, though lately I've been wondering why I bother going back to an empty ranch when the trail feels more like home than home does." "Lily Dawson," she replied, her voice still shaky but steadier now. "I work at the schoolhouse here in Scottsbluff, teaching children their letters and numbers. I'm grateful for the work, truly I am, but when the school day ends and I go back to my little cabin, the silence is so loud I sometimes think it might swallow me whole." Preston moved closer, standing beside her on the rise, looking up at the same moon she'd been addressing. "My mama used to say that the moon was a good listener because it had seen everything in its time." She said if you needed to tell your troubles to someone, the moon would hold them for you until you were strong enough to carry them yourself. Lily turned to look at him, really look at him, and Preston felt something shift in the air between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Two lonely souls finding each other in the darkness, both of them talking to the moon because there was no one else who would truly listen. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman," Lily said softly. "She was," Preston agreed. "And stubborn and kind, and she made the best apple pie in 3 counties. She died when I was 17, and there are still days when I turn to tell her something before I remember she's gone." "My mother was the same," Lily whispered. "She taught me to read when I was 4 years old, and she always said that books could take you anywhere, even when you were stuck in one place. After she died, I started teaching because I wanted other children to have what she gave me, but it doesn't fill the empty spaces she left behind." They stood there together in silence for a long moment, and Preston realized it was the most comfortable silence he'd experienced in years. It wasn't the oppressive quiet of an empty house or the awkward pause of forced conversation. It was the silence of two people who understood each other without needing to explain every detail, who recognized the same wounds in each other's eyes. "Would you like to sit for a while?" Preston asked, gesturing to the grass. "I've been riding all day and my bones could use the rest, and maybe we could both use the company of someone who understands." Lily hesitated for only a moment before nodding. They sat down on the prairie grass, the moon bathing them in pale light, and Preston was acutely aware of how close she was, how he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap and honest work. "Tell me about your ranch," Lily said. "Tell me what it's like when you're there, what makes it home despite the loneliness." Preston leaned back on his hands, looking up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "It's in southern Wyoming, near the mountains. My grandfather built the house with his own hands back in 1845, and my father expanded it when he married my mother. There's a creek that runs through the property, and in the summer, the wildflowers grow so thick you can barely see the ground. We've got good grazing land, and the cattle do well there when I'm actually present to tend them properly." "It sounds beautiful," Lily said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "It is," Preston admitted, "but beauty doesn't keep you warm at night and it doesn't answer when you call out. I've thought about selling it more times than I can count, but every time I get close, I remember my parents working that land, remember my sister learning to ride her first horse in the corral, and I can't bring myself to let go of those memories." "I understand that too," Lily said. "My parents' cabin is on the edge of town. I could have sold it after Papa died, could have moved into smaller rooms and used the money to make my life easier. But it still smells like my mother's cooking, and there's a porch where my father used to sit and smoke his pipe in the evenings, and leaving it would feel like losing them all over again." Preston turned to look at her profile in the moonlight, at the way sorrow and strength seemed to war across her features. "How do you do it? How do you keep going when everything feels so heavy?" "Some days I don't," Lily confessed. "Some days I barely make it through my lessons, and I go home and cry until I fall asleep. But then the sun rises again, and the children come to school with their bright faces and their endless questions, and I remember that life keeps moving whether we're ready or not. So I move with it even when I don't want to." "That takes courage," Preston said quietly. "It takes desperation," Lily corrected with a sad smile. "Courage would be choosing to face it. Desperation is just not knowing what else to do." Preston wanted to reach out and take her hand, wanted to tell her that he saw her courage even if she couldn't see it herself. But they were still strangers in most ways, bound only by their shared loneliness and this strange midnight meeting. Instead, he said, I was planning to move on in the morning, to take my cattle the rest of the way north, and then head home to that empty ranch. But I think I might stay in Scottsbluff for a few days, rest my horses and resupply. Maybe you could show me around town if you'd like the company. Lily turned to him, her eyes searching his face for something, though Preston wasn't sure what. You don't have to do that out of pity. I'll be fine. I always am. It's not pity, Preston said firmly. It's selfishness. I heard you talking to the moon about being tired of eating dinner alone, and I realized I've been doing the same thing for 2 years now. Maybe we could be tired of it together for a while, at least until I have to leave. Something softened in Lily's expression, a tiny crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. I make a decent pot roast on Sundays. You'd be welcome to share it if you're still in town. I'll be here, Preston promised, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. They talked until the moon began its descent toward the western horizon, sharing stories about their parents and their childhoods, about the little things that made them laugh and the big things that made them cry. Preston told her about learning to rope cattle from his father, about how his sister used to put flowers in his hat when he wasn't looking, about the way his mother would hum while she did the washing. Lily told him about reading by candlelight long after she was supposed to be asleep, about her father teaching her to fish in the North Platte River, about how her mother had sewn every dress she owned with careful, loving stitches. When the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, they finally stood up, stiff from sitting but somehow lighter than they'd been hours before. Preston walked Lily back toward town, leading his horse behind them, and they moved slowly as if reluctant to let the night end. Thank you for listening, Lily said when they reached the edge of her property, a small cabin with a neat garden and a porch exactly as she described. I've been talking to the moon for months now, and you're the first person who's ever heard me. Thank you for letting me stay, Preston replied. I think maybe the moon knew what it was doing bringing me through town tonight. Lily smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. Sunday dinner is at 2 o'clock. Don't be late. I wouldn't dream of it, Preston said, and he tipped his hat to her before leading his horse toward the livery stable at the center of town. He spent the next few days in Scottsbluff, ostensibly checking on his cattle and making repairs to his equipment, but really just counting the hours until Sunday afternoon. He found himself thinking about Lily constantly, about the way she'd looked standing under the moon with her arms raised to the sky, about the sound of her laughter when he'd told her a funny story about a stubborn bull. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long seemed to have loosened its grip, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. When Sunday finally arrived, Preston borrowed a washtub from the livery owner and scrubbed himself clean, put on his least worn shirt, and even attempted to tame his hair with some water and determination. He arrived at Lily's cabin at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked that morning from the prairie. Lily answered the door wearing a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair pinned up in a way that showed the elegant curve of her neck. You brought flowers, she said, her voice soft with surprise. I figured if I was coming to Sunday dinner, I should arrive like a gentleman, Preston replied, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a teenager courting his first sweetheart. They're beautiful, Lily said, taking the flowers and breathing in their sweet scent. Come in, please. Everything's ready. The inside of the cabin was simple but welcoming, with curtains at the windows and a braided rug on the floor. The table was set for two with mismatched china that Preston suspected had been collected over years, and the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air. It reminded him so much of his mother's kitchen that his throat tightened with emotion. "This is wonderful," Preston said, and he meant it. They sat down to eat, and the conversation flowed as easily as it had under the moonlight. Lily told him about her students, about the little boy who'd finally learned his multiplication tables, and the girl who wrote the most imaginative stories. Preston talked about his plans for the ranch, about how he wanted to improve his breeding stock and maybe build a new barn. They laughed over silly things and fell into comfortable silences, and Preston realized with startling clarity that he didn't want this day to end. After dinner, they sat on the porch with cups of coffee, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Preston found himself studying Lily's profile, the way the fading light caught in her hair, the peaceful expression on her face. "I need to head north in a few days," Preston said quietly. "But I'll be coming back through Scottsbluff in about 6 weeks, once I've delivered the cattle and settled some business at home. Could I write to you while I'm gone? Could we keep talking, even when we're apart?" Lily turned to look at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been joy. "I'd like that very much. I haven't had anyone to write to in so long, and I think I'd miss our conversations if they stopped now." "Then it's settled," Preston said, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I'll write from every town I pass through, and you can tell me all about your students and your days." "Preston," Lily said hesitantly, "what's happening here, between us?" Preston set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "I think we're finding something I didn't think existed anymore. I think we're finding someone who understands what it's like to carry loneliness like a weight, and someone who makes that weight feel a little bit lighter. I don't know what to call it yet, but I know I don't want to lose it." "Neither do I," Lily whispered, and when Preston reached out to take her hand, she let him, her fingers curling around his with a trust that felt precious and fragile. Preston left Scottsbluff 3 days later, his heart both heavy with leaving and light with the promise of return. He kissed Lily's cheek before he mounted his horse, a brief touch that felt more intimate than anything he'd experienced in years, and the blush that spread across her face made him want to stay forever. The journey north seemed longer than usual, every mile stretching out like an eternity. Preston wrote letters by campfire light, telling Lily about the landscape he passed through, about the storms that rolled across the plains, about how he caught himself looking at the moon every night and wondering if she was looking at it too. He mailed each letter from whatever town he passed through, and his heart leaped every time he arrived somewhere and found a letter from her waiting at the postal office. Lily's letters were beautiful and honest and full of the little details that made up her days. She wrote about the student who'd brought her a handful of dandelions, about the way the sunset looked from her porch, about how she'd started baking bread on Wednesdays because it made the house smell less empty. She wrote about missing him, about how strange it was to miss someone she'd only known for a few days, but how real the feeling was nonetheless. Preston delivered his cattle to a ranch outside Casper, Wyoming, and then headed home to his own property with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in years. The ranch looked the same as always, beautiful and lonely, but now instead of seeing only the emptiness, Preston found himself imagining what it might look like with someone else there. He pictured Lily standing on the porch, Lily reading in the rocking chair his mother used to love, Lily laughing in the kitchen while she cooked. He spent 2 weeks at home, repairing fences and checking on his breeding stock, but mostly thinking about Lily and counting the days until he could see her again. He wrote to her every evening, longer letters now that he had time to sit and really think about what he wanted to say. He told her about his dreams for the ranch, about how he wanted to build something lasting, about how he'd started imagining a future that didn't feel quite so lonely anymore. When Lily's responses came, they were equally honest. She wrote about how much she looked forward to his letters, about how she'd started talking to the moon less because she had someone real to talk to now. She wrote about being scared of caring too much too fast, but also about being more scared of letting fear stop her from reaching for happiness when it finally appeared. Preston couldn't wait any longer. He saddled his best horse and rode south toward Nebraska, pushing harder than he probably should have, driven by a need to see Lily that felt as essential as breathing. He arrived in Scottsbluff on a Thursday afternoon, dusty from the trail and exhausted from days of hard riding, but the moment he saw Lily walking out of the schoolhouse, none of it mattered. She looked up and saw him, and her face transformed with joy. She gathered her skirts and ran toward him, forgetting propriety and caution, and Preston dismounted just in time to catch her as she threw her arms around his neck. "You're here," she said against his shoulder, and he could feel her trembling. "You came back early." "I couldn't stay away," Preston admitted, holding her close and breathing in the scent of lavender and chalk dust. "I kept trying to focus on ranch work, but all I could think about was you. All I could think about was how much I wanted to see you again, to hear your voice instead of just reading your words." Lily pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining. "I've been counting the days. I tried to be patient, tried to focus on my students and my routine, but Preston, I missed you so much it hurt." "I love you," Preston said, the words coming out before he could stop them, raw and honest and true. "I know it's fast and maybe foolish, but I've been alone for so long that I know what nothing feels like, and this isn't nothing. This is everything. You're everything." Lily's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I love you too. I think I started loving you that first night when you stood on the hill with me and understood what I was feeling without me having to explain it. I tried to tell myself it was too soon, too much, but my heart didn't listen." Preston kissed her then. Proper townspeople and their opinions be damned, and Lily kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing and love they'd both been carrying. It was a kiss that tasted like hope and new beginnings, like two people who'd been lost finally finding their way home. When they finally pulled apart, Preston kept his forehead pressed against hers. "Come back to Wyoming with me, marry me. Let's build a life together and never be lonely again." "Yes," Lily said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it. I don't care that everyone will say it's too fast. I don't care that it hasn't even been 2 months since we met. I know what I want, and I want you. I want a life with you." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Scottsbluff, with Lily's few remaining friends as witnesses and the local pastor officiating. Lily wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper, and Preston wore a new suit he'd bought specially for the occasion. When they exchanged their vows, Preston's voice was strong and clear, and Lily's hands were steady in his. After the ceremony, they held a small gathering at Lily's cabin, and Preston watched his new wife laugh and talk with her friends, her face glowing with happiness. When she caught him watching her, she crossed the room and took his hand. "Ready to go home?" she asked softly. "With you?" "Always," Preston replied. They packed up Lily's belongings over the next few days, carefully wrapping her mother's china and her father's favorite books, taking only what held meaning and leaving the rest behind. Lily said goodbye to her students with tears and hugs, promising to write and tell them about her new life. She gave the cabin to the church to use for traveling ministers, knowing her parents would have approved of their home continuing to serve the community. The journey to Wyoming took almost a week, and Preston loved every moment of it. They traveled slowly, stopping to camp under the stars and talk for hours about everything and nothing. Preston taught Lily how to start a fire with flint and steel, and Lily taught him a song her mother used to sing. At night, they lay close together in their bedrolls, watching the moon travel across the sky, and Preston marveled at how different the world looked now that he wasn't facing it alone. When they finally reached the ranch, Preston pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the rise that overlooked the property. "There it is," he said. "Your new home." Lily gasped softly. The house sat in a valley with mountains rising behind it, exactly as Preston had described. The creek sparkled in the afternoon sun, and wildflowers dotted the meadows with color. Smoke rose from the chimney where Preston's ranch hand. An older man named Charlie, who looked after things when Preston was away, had clearly prepared for their arrival. "It's beautiful," Lily breathed. "Preston, it's more beautiful than I imagined." They rode down to the house together, and Charlie came out to greet them with a wide smile. "About time you brought home a wife, boss. This place has needed a woman's touch for too long." Charlie had prepared a welcome home dinner, and after they ate, he excused himself to the bunkhouse, leaving Preston and Lily alone in the house that was now truly theirs. Preston showed Lily around, pointing out the rooms his grandfather had built and the additions his father had made. He showed her the bedroom that had been his parents', now freshly cleaned and waiting for them. "We can change anything you want," Preston said. "New curtains, new furniture, whatever you need to make it feel like home." Lily turned to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "It already feels like home because you're here. Everything else is just details." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Lily transformed the house with small touches, hanging curtains she'd sewn herself and filling vases with wildflowers. She took over the kitchen, and the house was soon filled with the smells of fresh bread and hearty stews. Preston taught her to ride properly, and they spent long afternoons exploring the property together, Preston pointing out boundary markers and good fishing spots. Charlie adored Lily, and she treated him like family, making sure he joined them for dinner most evenings, and listening with genuine interest to his stories about the old days. The ranch began to feel alive again, filled with laughter and conversation, and the sound of people who cared about each other. At night, Preston and Lily would sit on the porch, and sometimes Lily would look up at the moon with a soft smile. "You still talk to it?" Preston asked one evening. "Not the way I used to," Lily admitted. "Now when I look at the moon, I thank it for bringing you to me that night. I thank it for listening to my loneliness until you could come along and help me heal it." "It brought you to me too," Preston said, pulling her close. "I was so lost, Lily. I was just going through the motions of living without really understanding why. You gave me a reason. You gave me everything." As the months passed, their love deepened and grew. They learned each other's rhythms and routines, discovered each other's quirks and habits. Preston learned that Lily sang while she cooked, that she read voraciously and could argue passionately about literature, that she cried during thunderstorms, because they reminded her of the night her mother died. Lily learned that Preston talked to the horses when he thought no one was listening, that he had a talent for whittling and often made small wooden animals for her, that he had nightmares sometimes about being alone again. They held each other through the hard moments and celebrated the good ones. When Preston successfully negotiated a contract to sell his beef to a supplier in Cheyenne, Lily made his favorite pie to celebrate. When Lily received a letter from one of her former students telling her that he'd been accepted to a teaching college, Preston took her dancing at the town social to mark the occasion. Their first winter together was harsh, with snow piling up past the windows and temperatures dropping so low the creek froze solid. But inside the ranch house, there was warmth and love, and the knowledge that they were facing the cold together. They spent evenings by the fire, Lily reading aloud while Preston worked on tack repairs, and Preston couldn't remember ever being so content. Spring came with a rush of melting snow and budding trees, and Lily discovered she was pregnant. Preston was splitting wood when she told him, and he dropped the axe and picked her up, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We're having a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We're going to be parents." "We are," Lily confirmed, her own eyes bright with tears of joy. "Our baby will be born in the fall, probably October." Preston was attentive and protective throughout her pregnancy, sometimes comically so. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, insisted she rest more than she wanted to, and generally drove her a little crazy with his concern. But Lily loved him for it, loved knowing that he cared so deeply, that he was so invested in their future together. They spent the summer preparing for the baby, turning the small room next to theirs into a nursery. Preston built a cradle from oak wood, sanding it smooth and carving small stars into the headboard. Lily sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with the same careful precision her mother had once used. Charlie proved surprisingly helpful, sharing advice from when his own children had been born years ago. The baby arrived on a crisp October morning, after a night of labor that left both Preston and Lily exhausted. Doc Wilson from the nearest town had come to help, and when the baby's first cry filled the air, Preston felt his heart expand with a love he hadn't known was possible. "It's a boy," Doc Wilson announced, placing the tiny, squalling infant in Lily's arms. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs." Lily looked down at their son with wonder, tears streaming down her face. "He's perfect. Preston, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." Preston sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arms around both his wife and his son, feeling like his life had come full circle. The loneliness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a love so profound it sometimes took his breath away. "What should we name him?" he asked softly. "Samuel," Lily said after a moment. "Samuel James Norwood. James was my father's name." "Samuel James Norwood," Preston repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect. He's perfect. You're perfect." The early days with Samuel were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Preston learned to change diapers and warm bottles, to soothe a crying baby in the middle of the night and function on minimal sleep. Lily recovered from the birth with Preston's constant support, and together they navigated the challenges of new parenthood. Charlie was besotted with little Samuel, carving him toys and telling him stories, even though the baby was far too young to understand. The ranch continued to thrive, and Preston found ways to manage his work while still being present for his family. He hired another ranch hand to help Charlie, a young man named Tom who was hardworking and reliable, and that freed up more time for Preston to spend with Lily and Samuel. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew into a curious, energetic toddler who loved following his father around the ranch and listening to his mother read stories. When he was 3, Lily gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Grace, and the house became even more chaotic and joyful. Preston built an addition to give the growing family more room, and Lily somehow managed to keep everyone fed and clothed while also maintaining her love of reading and learning. The children grew up surrounded by love and wide open spaces. Samuel learned to ride before he could properly run, and the twins were inseparable from birth, inventing elaborate games in the meadows and splashing in the creek. Preston taught them all about ranching, about respecting the land and the animals, about the value of hard work. Lily taught them to read and write, filling their minds with stories and knowledge, making sure they understood that education was a gift on clear nights. The family would sometimes sit on the porch together, looking up at the moon and stars. Samuel would ask endless questions about the constellations, and the twins would make up their own stories about what they saw in the sky. Preston and Lily would exchange glances over their children's heads, remembering that first night when the moon had witnessed their loneliness and somehow orchestrated their meeting. You ever think about what your life would be like if you hadn't stopped that night? Lily asked Preston one evening after the children were finally asleep and they had a rare moment of quiet. Preston pulled her closer on the porch swing he'd built. "I try not to, because it's too painful to imagine. I'd probably still be trailing cattle and going home to that empty house, probably still talking to the moon myself and wondering if anyone would ever understand." "I think about it sometimes," Lily admitted. "I think about how close I came to just accepting that loneliness was going to be my life. If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't listened, I might still be standing on that hill every night pouring my heart out to the sky." "But I did stop," Preston said firmly. "And you did let me listen. And look at what we built from that moment, Lily. Look at this beautiful, chaotic, wonderful life we have." "It's more than I ever dreamed possible," Lily agreed. "When my parents died, I thought all the love in my life had died with them. I thought I was meant to be alone, that maybe some people just weren't meant for happiness. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that love can find you even in the darkest moments if you're brave enough to stay open to it." Preston kissed her temple. "You saved me just as much as I saved you. We saved each other." As the years passed, the ranch prospered. Preston's careful management and quality cattle earned him a reputation as one of the best ranchers in Wyoming. They were able to buy additional land, expanding their operation while still maintaining the family focus that was so important to both of them. Samuel grew into a fine young man who loved ranching as much as his father did, and he started taking on more responsibility as he got older. The twins were bright and spirited, and Lily homeschooled them along with Samuel, making sure they had every educational opportunity. When Samuel was 15 and the twins were 12, Lily gave birth one more time to a baby boy they named Daniel. The older children adored their little brother, and Daniel grew up surrounded by doting siblings and parents who still looked at each other with the same love they'd felt that first night under the moon. Preston and Lily's marriage continued to deepen and strengthen. They had disagreements sometimes, as all couples do, but they'd learned early on to talk through their problems, to listen to each other the way Preston had listened to Lily that first midnight. Their physical love remained passionate and tender, a celebration of the connection that bound them together. Their emotional intimacy was even stronger, built on years of shared experiences and unwavering support. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Preston took Lily back to the hill outside Scottsbluff, where they'd first met. They'd traveled there ostensibly to visit the graves of Lily's parents, but Preston had planned this side trip carefully. They stood on the same rise where Lily had once poured out her loneliness to the moon, but now they stood together, Preston's arm around her waist, both of them healthy and happy and so deeply in love. 20 years, Lily marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've been together forever. Both are true, Preston said. Every day with you feels new, but also like I've known you my entire life, like I was waiting for you without even knowing it. I was so lost when you found me, Lily remembered. So broken and alone and convinced that was all I'd ever be. Thank you for seeing past all of that, for hearing what I needed even when I was just talking to the moon. Thank you for letting me in, Preston replied. Thank you for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy who showed up in the middle of the night. Thank you for building this incredible life with me. They stood there as the moon rose, the same moon that had witnessed their first meeting, and Lily smiled up at it. Thank you for listening, she whispered to the bright orb. Thank you for bringing him to me. Preston held her close as stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. He thought about the young man he'd been, so lost and lonely that he'd almost ridden past that night. He thought about the woman Lily had been, so desperate for connection that she'd been talking to the moon. And he thought about what they'd become together, a partnership built on understanding and respect, and a love that had only grown stronger with time. Their children were all thriving. Samuel was now helping run the ranch and courting a nice girl from town. The twins were preparing to attend a women's college in the East, both determined to become teachers like their mother. Daniel, at 5 years old, was already showing signs of being as horse-crazy as his father had been. The ranch was successful beyond what Preston had dared dream. They employed several ranch hands now, good men who were treated like family. The house had been expanded twice more to accommodate their growing family, but it still retained the warmth and love that Lily had brought to it from the beginning. As they stood on that hill, Preston realized that every lonely night he'd endured, every moment of despair and isolation, had been leading him to this, to Lily, to their children, to a life so full of love and purpose that his younger self wouldn't have been able to imagine it, ready to go home. Lily asked, echoing the words she'd said on their wedding day. "With you, always," Preston replied with the same words he'd answered then, and he meant them just as much now as he had 20 years ago. They returned to their ranch, to their children and their life together. Samuel had dinner waiting, having taken charge in their absence, and the meal was filled with laughter and conversation, and the easy affection of a family that genuinely enjoyed each other's company. After dinner, the twins played piano while Daniel begged for stories, and Preston and Lily sat together on the sofa, watching their children and marveling at what they'd created. That night, lying in bed with Lily's head on his shoulder, Preston thought about how different his life might have been. He might have ridden past Scottsbluff that night. He might never have heard Lily talking to the moon. He might have spent the rest of his life carrying that loneliness like a stone in his chest. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Lily replied, her voice sleepy and content. "Every single day I love you more." Preston closed his eyes, listening to his wife's breathing slow into sleep, hearing the quiet sounds of his children sleeping in nearby rooms. The loneliness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by belonging and connection and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The moon shone through their window, casting silver light across the bed, and Preston silently thanked it for being there that night, for bearing witness to Lily's pain and somehow guiding him to her. He'd been looking for purpose, for meaning, for a reason to keep going, and he'd found it all in a lonely woman talking to the moon at midnight. As the years continued to pass, Preston and Lily grew old together, their hair turning silver and their steps slowing, but their love never diminishing. They became grandparents as Samuel married his sweetheart and started his own family. The twins both became teachers as they'd planned, though Emma eventually returned to Wyoming to teach in a school near the ranch, while Grace settled in Boston with her professor husband. Daniel took over much of the ranch operations as Preston's arthritis made physical work harder, proving to be just as capable as his father. On warm summer evenings, Preston and Lily would still sit on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains and the moon rise over the prairie. They'd hold hands and talk about their day, about their children and grandchildren, about the memories they'd accumulated over a lifetime together. "You remember what you said to the moon that first night?" Preston asked one evening when they were both in their 70s. "Every word," Lily replied. "I was so desperate for someone to understand, so tired of being alone. I never imagined that someone was actually listening, that my prayers were about to be answered in the form of a lonely cowboy on a horse. Best night of my life, Preston said. Even before I knew what it would lead to, just listening to you, understanding that I wasn't alone in feeling that way, it changed something in me. We healed each other, Lily said softly. Two broken people who found each other in the darkness and decided to build something beautiful. Preston raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. I'd do it all again. Every hard moment, every challenge, every tear, I'd do it all again to end up right here with you. So would I, Lily agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder the way she'd done countless times over the decades. So would I. They sat together as the stars came out. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a love story from loneliness and midnight confessions, and a moon that listened. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across the country now, living their own lives, but they all carried the legacy of Preston and Lily's love, the understanding that even in the darkest loneliness, connection and hope were possible. Preston died peacefully in his sleep at 78, with Lily beside him and their children gathered around. His last words were to tell Lily he loved her, and she held his hand until the very end, her heart breaking but also grateful for the 54 years they'd had together. Lily lived for 5 more years, surrounded by family and memories. She never remarried, telling her children that she'd had the love of a lifetime and didn't need to search for another. She spent her remaining years writing down the story of how she and Preston met, wanting future generations to know that their great love had started with loneliness and a moon that brought two souls together. On clear nights, Lily would sit on the porch and look up at the moon, talking to Preston now instead of pouring out her loneliness. She'd tell him about the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the ranch that was still thriving under Daniel's management, about how much she missed him but how grateful she was for every moment they'd shared. When Lily died at 83, surrounded by 3 generations of family, her last words were about Preston, about how she'd see him soon and they'd never be apart again. She was buried beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, under the wide Wyoming sky where the moon and stars could watch over them for eternity. Their children placed a special headstone above their graves, one that reads simply, Preston and Lily Norwood. Two lonely souls who found each other under the moon and built a lifetime of love, forever together. And on clear nights, when the moon was full and bright, family members swore they could feel Preston and Lily's presence on that hill, still together, still in love, proof that even the deepest loneliness could be healed by understanding, connection, and the courage to open your heart when love finally appeared.